Listening is the most important skill of all, because it accelerates all other learning and is crucial for social integration. Let's have a look at the best free Chinese listening resources for beginners, intermediate, and advanced students. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about listening resources for learning Chinese. I have published an article called The 10 Best Listening Resources for Beginners, Intermediate, and Advanced Students, and this podcast episode is a companion to that article. It won't contain exactly the same content as the written article, because some things really don't work very well in a podcast format. For example, you cannot click the words that I say, and if you want a resource for, say, intermediate, you have to try to find the right spot in the podcast where I talk about this, whereas on the website you can just click intermediate and get all the recommendations you want. Therefore, if you want the actual list, I strongly suggest that you check the article on Hacking Chinese, and in this podcast episode, I will talk more about the list itself, the resources on it in general, and some things you can and should do to get more out of the listening you are doing. I also have some practical tips and tricks that are relevant regardless of which resource you use. I have talked about listening ability on the podcast before many times, and I will make sure to put links in the show notes for those of you who want to check that out. But I also intend this episode to be able to stand on its own legs, so I will include the most important information here as well. I want to start this discussion by saying that you are probably not listening as much as you should. Most students that I meet or I talk to for some other reason mostly listen in class. They maybe do a listening comprehension exercise sometimes, and they might have found a podcast they listen to occasionally. Maybe if they listen to my advice, they actually have several podcasts and they listen to them a little bit more. But this is still far from as much as they should be listening. And if you add up all the other things that they are doing, listening actually turns out to take up a very small part of their total study time. Whereas I think that at least half that time should be spent on listening. This might sound a little bit extreme to some of you, but remember that I do include all types of listening, so I don't mean that you should spend half your time in the library with earphones. I also include when you listen to Chinese when you're out walking, on your commute, when you drive somewhere, when you're jogging, when you're doing the laundry, and so on. So you can actually accumulate a lot of listening time over a week without actually scheduling any studying at all. You just need to build the right habits. And I have talked about all these things before, so I will put lots of links in the description of this episode so you can check that out. So one of the reasons you should listen more is that it's simply easier to get a lot of listening done. You can't really read while you are cooking, and you cannot write characters while walking outside, or it would be dangerous to do so or bad for other reasons. Whereas listening can really be combined with almost anything. The most important role of listening is not that it's easy to perform, though, it is that it provides you with input. And hopefully it will provide you with comprehensible input, i.e. spoken Chinese that you can understand and make sense of, preferably without having to use a dictionary or look things up too much. This is obviously important for listening ability itself. If you listen more, you will get better at it, you'll get faster, and when you've heard a word a few hundred times, your brain will be able to process it very quickly, and you can then focus on other harder things in that sentence you just heard. This is also a great source of learning more words, of course, because if you have context and you understand almost everything else, if there is a word that keeps recurring in something you're listening to, you will sooner or later be able to figure out what it means, usually, provided that you have context and you know the other things in that passage. And of course, this is the reason why you want to listen to things you can make sense of on your own without struggling too much, because that makes it much more likely that you will learn the things you didn't understand, and that way expand your knowledge about grammar, about vocabulary, and so on. Focusing on listening ability will not just improve your listening ability, however, it has huge impact on all areas of learning Chinese. So, for example, many people want to be able to speak Chinese fluently, whatever that means, and that is really something that can only be achieved if you also listen a lot. So one way of thinking about this is that your Chinese ability is like ice floating in water. And the speaking ability, it's the small part that sticks up over the surface that everybody can see. But if you want that to happen, you really have to have a lot of listening. You have to have a lot of input to build that speaking ability on, and that is the huge amount of ice that is actually lurking just below the surface. Listening will not just teach you words and how to use them and how to combine words into sentences, grammar, and so on. It will also provide a model for how spoken Chinese is supposed to sound, and you really can't get very good at pronunciation without also listening a lot, because you don't know what the target is actually supposed to look like. So listening and paying a lot of attention to how people say things, and this goes for not just word choice, but also how they use tones, how they enunciate, how they use prosody, and so on. This relationship is of course similar to that between writing and reading, because the best tip you can get to most people who want to write better is actually that they should read more. Because people who don't write well, they usually don't read a lot, and if they don't do that, they don't know what a good text is supposed to look like or how this language is used in writing. This is of course true for Chinese students as well, so if you want to get good at writing Chinese, you should read more. And if you want to improve your pronunciation, you should start listening more and really paying attention to what you're listening to if you aren't doing that already. So, as we have seen, listening and listening a lot is incredibly important. But there is a problem here for learners of Chinese, and that is, what should you listen to? It's fine if you listen to Chinese for half an hour a week. It's not that difficult to find something, or maybe your teacher has recommended something, you have a textbook, maybe you found a good podcast. But let's say that you are heeding my advice and you want to ramp up your listening. What should you listen to? Well, that's what the article on Hacking Chinese is for, and that's where I put all my best recommendations for all levels. But here I want to focus on some general principles, and that is a little bit different depending on what level you're on. As a beginner, the most serious problem is that there are very few resources out there that don't use a ton of English. And just to be very clear here, when I say that you're supposed to listen a lot, obviously only listening in Chinese counts, so listening to my podcast certainly doesn't count as listening ability. Obviously, I hope that it will have some other beneficial impact on your learning, but it's not listening comprehension as such. The same is true for other learner podcasts though, and there are many of these. Maybe you have a podcast where 90% of the content is in English, then you have a few sentences, a short dialogue or something in Chinese, and then they spend 20 more minutes explaining this in English with only occasional words in Chinese. And these resources might be useful for other things, but it's not really good for listening comprehension, because if you spend an hour with such a resource, maybe you only get a few minutes of listening out of it. And if you want to build tens of hours of listening, it will take forever with that type of resource. So on my list, I have stayed away from resources that use a lot of English. Maybe you want that for some other reason, maybe it makes you feel comfortable, but it's not helping you learn to understand spoken Chinese. It's then much better to try to find something that has as simple content as possible, listen to it many times, use different kinds of scaffolding and so on, but where you spend most of your time actually trying to understand what someone is saying in Chinese rather than listening to someone in English explain what you just heard. As you learn more, it will be slightly easier to find content, because producing content for zero beginners without relying too much on English is very, very hard, it's time-consuming and difficult. So you will not find a lot of that content, and most of it is not free. As you progress through the beginner stages, it will be easier though, and here I also want to say something about these levels. I keep talking about beginners, intermediate, and advanced learners, but actually this is a mess. So if you look at all the resources I recommended in the article on Hacking Chinese, they have many levels built into each, and they all use labels differently. And as a beginner, it's good to know that many of the labels are a little bit misleading, because there are many podcasts that think that they are, or at least they claim to be, zero beginner, for example. But there's actually a ton of content in there that is not at all suitable for beginners, and that most beginners don't know. It's also true that different creators use these labels very differently, so something that someone claims is actually lower intermediate might be beginner for someone else, and you just shouldn't take these labels too seriously. Instead, you should go in and listen and see what you think. If you listen and you don't understand anything at all, this is way too hard for you. If you listen and understand some things, and you listen and you understand even more the second time, then it might be worth checking out. As a beginner, you will probably not find resources where everything is easy, except for a few words that you are now ready to learn, but that's okay. The only way you can really get that is if you have a competent teacher who knows very well what you know and is able to tailor the content to exactly your situation. But this is, as I think is obvious, not something that can easily be done in a static content such as a podcast. When you have graduated from the beginner level to the intermediate level, there is a lot more to listen to, and here the range is rather broad. So we have content that is tailored for people who have a good grasp of the basic spoken language. They know most of the common words and sentence patterns and so on. But even if there will be many new words, the basic foundation is still there, so most of these resources should be only in Chinese, with the occasional use of English to explain certain things, but ideally it would be mostly in Chinese. The content here is still targeted at second language learners though, because listening to Chinese, which is spoken by native speakers for native speakers, is usually quite hard. You might be able to find specific examples where it works, but this is not an approach that will work for you as a student, even if you can have a teacher who can recommend certain things to you. There will simply be too many new words, too many things you don't actually need at your level, and tackling content that is way above your current level is usually just a big waste of time. I used to do that a lot, but I later realized that this is mainly a waste of time. So you should be listening at things at or slightly below your current level, or at least as close to it as you can. You should not strive to listen to things that are really, really hard, because you are just wasting your time. A good practical tip that you can use for figuring out if something is too difficult or not is to listen to it many times. If you listen to it once and got some kind of gist of what was going on, and then listen again and realize that you understand more, and you listen a third time and realize that now you understand quite a bit, and you can gradually understand more and more of what you're listening to, this is good. If you're listening and don't understand anything, and you listen again and you still basically don't understand anything, this is too hard. You need to find something else. This problem will of course persist to the advanced level, because that is also a level that is very wide. So you might just be transitioning to native content, and then it's good to know that some content is definitely harder than others. So for example, listening to something that's read aloud, such as an audiobook or maybe a news broadcast that's based on a written script, is much harder than listening to people talking about something. It's also good to know that some things are harder than they seem, so fiction in general is very difficult, whereas things that you might think are difficult actually aren't, and that might be academic content or educational content of different kinds. I don't intend to go into detail about this here, but if you are an advanced learner and want to understand more about what I'm talking about here, there are detailed discussions in the article on Hacking Chinese for the various types of advanced content that I recommend. So before wrapping up and sending you off to the article on Hacking Chinese to find the best resources for you, I'd like to share a few practical tips about listening. We did actually spend the entirety of episode 57 talking about 7 ideas for smooth and effortless listening, and just by saying the title there, you have a very important clue to what you should be doing, because you need to make sure that listening is effortless and smooth. And I don't mean related to the Chinese language, because obviously the content will be sometimes difficult and require effort from you. I mean that it should be effortless and smooth to get started. You need to establish habits, you need to take practical steps to make sure that you can listen as much as possible. Just as an example from that episode is to ask yourself right now, how long would it take you to start listening to some Chinese that's suitable for you? And ideally, the answer should be about 2 seconds. This means that you have to have done a lot of prep work. You have to make sure that you always have audio available on your phone. You need to have earphones, you need to have batteries charged, you need to have everything ready so that you can easily just push a button and keep listening on something you listened to before. If there are too many steps involved and you have to go find the audio, you have to choose what to listen to and so on, this takes too much time, it takes too much effort, and then you are likely to simply do something else, maybe listen to something in your native language instead. So make sure that listening is not a practical problem. And like I said, if you want a whole episode discussing this, check out episode 57. So how does that tip relate to the list I've published on Hacking Chinese for the best free listening resources then? Well, it depends on what resource we're talking about, but many resources I've recommended are videos. And that means that you probably need a device with a screen turned on to be able to listen to them. And the interface that you use, let's say it's YouTube because it's something everybody knows about, that interface is not maybe the best one for listening specifically. It is a video service after all. And if you're not a premium user, if you turn off your screen, then the audio also goes away. And this creates a lot of practical problems. So actually using, say, YouTube to listen sounds like a good thing, and I recommend many YouTube videos in the list, but they can be rather impractical to listen to. There are various ways of saving the audio from YouTube so you can have a pure audio file, and this of course depends on what's legal in your country and for specific providers and so on, so this is not blanket advice for how to do something. I just want to mention that the option is there. If we compare that with podcasts, and now I mean podcasts that are provided through some podcast platforms such as, say, Spotify or iTunes, then it's very, very easy to listen, and the service might even provide you with recommendations for other similar things you can listen to. So finding more content is kind of automatic. Well, YouTube does this too. It recommends more and more videos to you based on what you have watched, but you still need to watch them. Well, you can keep them on the background on your computer if you're doing something at home, but this is trickier when you're on the move. This is a nice segue into the next piece of advice I have, and that is to gradually build up an audio library of things you can listen to. And this means that you should save everything you listen to, because re-listening is great, so if you found something you've enjoyed or you found interesting or useful before, make sure you save it so it's easy to access again. And this is also important because you need to be able to listen to things with different intensity. So for example, if you're tired and you don't feel like listening to something super hard, well, then you need to be able to listen to something easy and relaxing, maybe a few songs you've learned the lyrics to previously. It still counts as some listening, you're reviewing the vocabulary and so on, but it doesn't feel like studying at all. But at another time, you might feel full of energy and want to tackle a challenge, and then you can tackle more difficult audio. And as you work with that piece of audio, you listen to it many times, you revisit it later, it will then gradually become something easy that you can put on later when you don't feel you want to tackle something new. But all this is dependent on you keeping everything that you're listening to, and you should really build this library. To make sure we adhere to the advice I gave just before that, you also need to make sure that this audio library is easy to access. My final piece of advice is related to reading and listening, and there typically are more reading resources than there are listening resources, probably because they are easier to create and publish. However, many of these resources also have audio, and here it's important that you listen before you read. Because if you read and then listen, you've kind of spoiled it as listening practice, but the opposite is not really a problem because there are plenty of reading resources that don't even have audio, so if you want to read before you listen, as it were, then you can just pick anything. Whereas if there is audio, make sure you listen before you read. I think that's enough advice for now, and like I said, I've put many links to other articles and podcast episodes about listening in the description of this episode, so you can check those out. Of course, you should also check the article on Hacking Chinese that contains the actual list of recommended resources, and this took a very, very long time to compile, so I would be very happy if you shared it with your classmates or your teacher or other people who might be interested. Naturally, I'm just one person, and I cannot listen to all the resources that are available online, and there are constantly new resources being produced as well. So if you know of a good listening resource that I haven't mentioned, be it for beginners, intermediate, or advanced learners, I would be very happy if you left a comment over at Hacking Chinese. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.